Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Welcome to our webinar on illegal fishing and conserving the health of our ocean, sponsored by the BU Alumni Association. My name is Peter Buston. I'm an associate professor of biology and the director of the BU Marine Program in BU's College of Arts and Sciences. The BU Marine Program hosts an interdisciplinary marine science degree. It's an incredibly popular degree program that has doubled in enrollment over the last 5 years. We now have 100 majors in the program, and it has a heavy emphasis on experiential learning and is set to grow a lot over the next 5 years. Some housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's presentation will be recorded, so please be aware of that. Our speakers are very eager to answer questions you may have, and you're welcome to submit them through the presentation using the Q&A box, which you'll see on the bottom right of your menu bar in the Zoom window. I want to take a moment to introduce our speakers today. First of all, Dr. Kelly Kryc. She's the Deputy Assistant for International Fisheries at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. She has extensive policy sector, academic, nonprofit, and legislative experience in energy and environmental policy. Prior to joining NOAA in September 2021, she had most recently served as a senior fellow for energy and environment at the Center for American Progress and as a director of ocean policy at the New England Aquarium in Boston. Previous positions also include those with the US Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, the US State Department, the White House of Science and Technology Policy, and the US Department of the Interior. She's also an adjunct faculty member of Georgetown University's Science in Public Interest program, where she teaches science policy. She received a Ph.D. in Earth Science from Boston University, an MS in Oceanography from the Graduate School of Oceanography at the University of Rhode Island, and a BA in Geology and Marine Science from Middlebury College in Vermont. She did the tour of New England for her education. I'm also delighted to welcome Fabien Cousteau. He is the founder of the Fabien Cousteau Ocean Learning Center and Proteus Ocean Group. He also occupies the roles of Aquanaut, Oceanic, Oceanographic explorer, and documentary filmmaker. As the first grandson of Jacques Cousteau, Fabien spent his early years aboard his grandfather's ships, learning how to scuba dive as early as his 4th birthday. From 2000 to 2002, he was explorer at large for National Geographic and collaborated on a television special aimed at challenging public attitudes about sharks called Attack of a Mystery Shark. From 2003 to 2006, he produced the documentary Mind of a Demon that aired on CBS. In early 2009, Fabien began working with local communities and children worldwide to help restore local water ecosystems. He continues to pursue these initiatives through his nonprofit dedicated to the restoration of the world's water bodies through active community engagement and education. And Fabien is also a BU alum. He majored in economics and graduated from Metropolitan College at BU. So thanks both of you for joining us today, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have. And so before we dive deeply into illegal fishing and conserving the health of our ocean, I want to start with a simple question. Why do you and other people like to fish and eat fish?
Ladies first.
Thank you. Thank you. If I could just take a moment, since this is a BU alumni panel, and reflect a little bit on the value of the PhD I received from Boston University. As an earth scientist, I was given a really amazing education that allowed me to see earth processes collectively and look at things through time. And that has served me really well. As Peter described my background, I've been able to work in the energy sector, in the environment sector, in science and in policy. And so because of what we're doing here today, I just wanted to reflect on that before I answered this question, which is why fish? And I think fish are an amazing protein source. We all know that it's a healthy part of our diet. sustainably caught wild fish actually have a much lower carbon footprint than some other protein sources that are land-based, like beef and pork and poultry. And so it can be part of a low carbon solution for our future. And so those are two of the reasons I think fish. And in the United States, we have some of the most sustainable fisheries in the world. And so this is a very good choice for the American economy as well. So I'll keep that brief and turn it over to my co-panelist.
Fabien? Kelly. Yeah, excellent question. And to follow Kelly's lead, the education I got at Buston University was phenomenal in a university setting. But one of the things that as a ADD type of personality that I learned the best of was going out in the field, learning from those experts that dedicate their lives to their studies out there, and to be able to participate in a lot of the interactive activities. I feel like that's the best way that I learned growing up. And coupled with, of course, the academic underpinnings that gave a really interesting perspective of what the ocean means to us. As far as seafood, or as far as fishing, I actually don't eat that much fish, and less so these days because of all the things that we face today. We treat our ocean as an endless resource in a garbage can, as we all know at this point. And unfortunately, about 60% of the world's wild fish stocks have been wiped out because of unsustainable practices. I don't like the word sustainability because it's subject to interpretation in many ways. There are some countries out there that do things better than others, but by and large, we're clear cutting our natural resource bank account, and we're going bankrupt. So as an individual, I have to sometimes make hard choices and not choose certain target species that otherwise would be easy to do so in restaurants and supermarkets. And at the same time, try and counterbalance that by choosing better options, or if I don't see them, be able to talk to the restaurant owner or chef or the supermarket manager to ask them questions about why they're offering certain species. So that said, I'm a terrible fisherman, to be honest. I'm all for people fishing. 2.3 billion people depend on fishing for their livelihoods. But at the end of the day, I'm not one of them because I would starve to death.
Thanks, Fabien. You actually touched on another point which I wanted to move to as we move through this conversation. And you talked about overfishing a little bit. And so I'm wondering if we can, so that everybody's on the same page in the audience, if we can sort of define overfishing and just briefly say, where is it happening? What are its causes? And what are the implications of overfishing?
That's buckshot if I ever saw it. I guess it's very complicated. Fish don't have passports. Oceans don't have physical borders. And so it's a communal good in many ways, especially with the pelagics, the traveling animals. And those waters that are in national territorial waters certainly have issues that are oftentimes specific to that localized area. And so the answer is not as simple as one would imagine, as having a global answer to each one of the aspects. I don't know that there's an answer per se to the global issues, unless we drill down into the specific actions of a company or of a country. But the United States, as Kelly said, tends to be leading in many ways to better management of a lot of these fisheries, and to create marine protected areas that are truly protected, which are some steps in the direction of creating a synergy to refill that natural resource bank account.
Peter, I'll try to Yeah, I'll try to keep that really simple. And overfishing is when you remove more fish than the population can sustain, so that what you're aiming for is population that's either growing or maintaining. And we can do that using science. And as a scientist, that's really meaningful to me. The way that the United States manages its fisheries is science-based. And so, and then because of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, we're also very regulated in how that happens. Now, to be clear, we're in New England. So in some cases, if you have pushed a population of fish, a species of fish too far beyond recovery, it won't recover. And we face that here in New England, particularly with cod species. Some of our favorite fish, some of the fish that really grew our economy here in New England. And so those problems are then exacerbated by the environmental challenges faced by the ocean, things that human activities have just put pressure on the ocean and its ecosystems, things like pollution, things like climate change, things that are changing the environment irreparably for species to survive and thrive. So it's even more incumbent on us for any fishing activity for us to be doing that responsibly, to be doing that science-based, and identifying really a proactive posture for how we address these changes in the future. And I would add, because I represent the international fisheries piece of what the US government is doing, that while we do a lot of that here in the United States, we also are trying to lead those conversations internationally on the high seas to ensure that the standards we have here in the United States, we're trying to advocate for those internationally as well, so that in the analogy of a rising tide, all ships rise in the rising tide. And I totally got that wrong, but you all know what I'm talking about.
Kelly, I would say, being a non-government employee, I'll take some liberties here. Science is the baseline for decision-making, for sure, but you have to have a government and people who are not only educated in the problems, but also motivated to be part of the solutions. And in many ways, there's not a country on this planet that's not exempt from criticism of having mismanaged the natural resources around us. But that said, there's an opportunity as well as we forge forward in modern ways of communicating to be able to be part of that solution. As you pointed out, New England has had a history of overfishing practices. And this isn't just fishing. You touched on pollution and a few other things, climate change related issues, which further complicate the conversation, obviously, and are huge influential factors in a lot of the inputs that generate the results that we see today. But why? I'll quote my grandfather basically. Why are we still hunter-gatherers in the ocean when we've been farmers on land for over 10,000 years? Why we should be farming, not going out and hunter-gathering. We take a lot of pressure off the wild stocks that way, but we have to do it properly.
Are we gonna dive into that one?
I have a question. I wanted to pick up on something else you said, Kelly, and I think we'll come back to that a little later on. But Kelly, you mentioned the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and I think probably the three of us on the call are familiar with that, but maybe many of the attendees aren't. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that, and sort of in the context of what are the common ways of preventing overfishing that you talked about, and how do regulations like the Magnuson-Stevens Act work, and how do they get enforced?
Those are all good questions, and I'm going to try to remember each of the three pieces. But the Magnuson-Stevens Act was passed, I believe, in 1976. And somebody in the audience who might know that can correct me if I'm wrong, or one of you can as well. And really, the first iteration of that was to eliminate foreign vessels from fishing in the U.S. exclusive economic zone. So the space between the coast and 200 miles out. And that was the primary reason for it. That bill has been modified 2 or 3 times now. And in the most recent reauthorization, it really put the science-based precautionary approach into the implementation of the law by requiring rebuilding plans for stocks that had been overfished or are subject to overfishing, with the goal of rebuilding those stocks. And it's been incredibly successful throughout most of the regions of the United States. We're seeing successful rebuilding, which enables our fishing fleet to have a sustainable source of fish to go and catch every year. And so it's really worked for fishermen. It's worked for people who enjoy eating fish, and it's worked for the United States. Because of its success, that's why we try to, in the international space, demonstrate that highly regulated fisheries that are based in science can be successful. Okay, so that's the story of Magnuson at a high level. Peter, could you remind me the second two pieces of that?
So that's an example of a regulation that the US has brought in. And then my next question was, clearly these regulations need enforcing. So how do regulations and enforcement work together to prevent overfishing?
Yes, Congress passes the law, and then that comes to NOAA for us to pass the regulations. And they do that through a series of fisheries management councils that really represent different sectors of society who work with the science to define what the catch limits are going to be, what the gear is going to be allowed, are there ecosystem protections. All of that can be part of a successful management plan. And the enforcement is really based on, we have a Coast Guard, the NOAA has an Office of Law Enforcement, and we are diligently checking to make sure that our fishing fleet is complying with those regulations. And really, they're incentivized to do so. It doesn't help anyone to not follow these regulations. Overfished stocks are subject to shutdowns, and that hurts everyone. So by playing by the rules here, I think that our system demonstrably works. But there's also, as we've seen in New England, a couple places where more work is needed to help certain regions catch up to enable the same success in other regions.
Thanks, Kelly. Fabien, do you want to comment on that and maybe talk a little bit about sort of smaller scale communities and international perspective?
Right. So going back to what I originally said, which is there are no borders for sea life. It's easy to manage a localized area if you have eyes on the area. As soon as things are out of sight, it becomes more complicated. So illegal fishing practices, even if it's not from your own fleet or your own country, may be coming from abroad. And that happens a lot in different parts of the world. There are communities out there, though, that are oftentimes self-regulating. And we've been able to film them and see them throughout the 3 generations in my family, including up in the Amazon with the Pirarucu, which are the prehistoric lung breathers, the local community up there in the Javari Valley were self-regulating their fishing practices to make sure that they had a fishery that could sustain their children and grandchildren, so on and so forth. The scientists were skeptical about this. Having gone in there, they found out that actually within less than 10% of the ratios, they were actually doing a great job. So there was no need for external government pressure for them to do so. Similar in Fiji, where they have rotating practices of fishing, rotating fishing areas on a regular basis. They give nature a break in separate different coral reef ecosystems by realizing that in the past anyway, that they've overfished an area and it wipes out the entire ecosystem. And so these sorts of things do happen. They're not frequent enough. One last example. When we went to the Poor Knights National Marine Sanctuary in New Zealand, originally there was a big resistance by the fishermen in the local fleets because they felt the government was taking their livelihood away. Well, within less than 5 years, they were catching over twice as many fish as they'd ever caught before around the perimeter of that marine protected park, the Poor Knights National Marine Sanctuary. And they've become the biggest advocates and protectors of that marine park, that marine protected area, and actually are petitioning to double or triple even the size of that marine protected area because they've seen the value of doing so.
That's a cool story to finish on. The Poor Knights is lovely for anybody who wants to visit. It's an amazing place.
Gorgeous diving, yeah.
Okay, so we see multiple ways of sort of preventing overfishing at national, local, regional scales. And these mechanisms are there. So let's bring us to really the sort of topic of today's webinar. That is, what is illegal fishing and what is unreported and unregulated fishing? And this sometimes goes by the acronym IUU. And Kelly, maybe you can kick us off with that.
Yes, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is something that I is a priority of mine in my role at NOAA. It's basically, without going into the very granular details, it's fishing that happens outside of the rules. It's taking fish where the fishing hasn't been licensed. It's using the wrong gear. It's not reporting what you've caught, which influences the science-based decision-making part. It's a whole lot of different things that collectively disadvantage people who are following the rules, that artificially drive prices of seafood lower, and end up harming the ocean ecosystem by taking more than can be sustained. That's a very simple, high-level explanation of IUU fishing, and it's something that the United States is committed to combating, preventing, and deterring.
Thanks. That's a super succinct explanation. Fabien, do you have anything to add on that from sort of the private sector perspective?
Well, I'm certainly not a policy expert, nor do I work in the government, so I don't feel comfortable talking about that aspect. But as an observer, as a diver for a while now, to me, I believe in human beings, right? I believe in the goodness of humans in general, although of course we all have our tendencies to exaggerate and cheat and all that when we can. Hopefully not too much. But what happens sometimes is, although a practice may not technically be illegal in a certain country's waters, it would be unethical or against common sense. And sometimes people do that occasionally for pragmatic reasons, because they need to sustain their family, and sometimes because, well, maybe they're not a good person or a good entity, and they would rather take from that natural resource bank account for their own private benefit and interest, despite the fact that that may not be for the greater good or the good of the future of fishing.
Kelly, I wanted to deal, because I know there's another set of issues that goes along with illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And those are something you told me about when we were prepping for this, which I wasn't so aware of, which are the forced labor issues. And I'm wondering if you can tell us all a bit more about those and the challenges that are faced there.
Yes, I appreciate that question. I think it's really important to raise this issue as we think about human rights and when we, in the seafood industry, as I mentioned, prices are oftentimes artificially depressed by illegal fishing, and one of the ways that is sustained is through labor violations and the use of forced labor at sea for people who are vulnerable, primarily migrant workers. Who might be misled into what they are signing into and find themselves at sea for multiple years without access to their passports, not being able to see their family. Sometimes even they lose their lives at sea. This is not limited to at-sea operations. This also happens in the processing facilities for seafood in other parts of the world. And the cheap seafood that comes from that is something that we're looking at into the United States. We're looking at, from the perspective of the United States, of how do we identify, one, where forced labor has been used to produce seafood, either at sea or on land. How do we prevent that from coming in? The United States imports 80% of our seafood. We have a huge market share. And because of that market power, have the ability to change practices by demanding better of our supply chain. Both, we'd like to not see any illegal, any IUU fishing products coming in. We would also not like to see forced labor being used to produce these commodities that we really depend on. And so I feel like it's like to just raise awareness of the issue, and also say that in my role, I'm addressing this and working across the whole of the government on all sorts of human rights violations as we try to make life a little better for people across the world, particularly where we have so much market power to influence how the global market is behaving on this issue.
That's great. You sort of raise a whole bunch of issues that people may not traditionally think of as being fishing issues, right? That are sort of similar to, factory chain issues, with environmental pollution and forced labor issues, which I don't think people often put together with fishing necessarily. Yeah, that's interesting.
I'll add one more point, that as overfishing is happening in different nations' exclusive economic zones, that pushes the fleets further and further out. And because of that, there's an added cost, more fuel. You need a better ship to do that. You need different resources, and that then further incentivizes the use of cheap or free labor that then ends up exploiting humans in the production of these products.
Yeah, I think the scenario of the carrot and the stick is certainly one to think of when talking about things that you can't control, meaning that as a resident of the United States, or as a government entity in the United States, you can control what the US does to some extent, to a greater extent. But your partners overseas, your business partners who may be selling some of this sea stock, don't necessarily have the same rules and limitations. May not have maybe a little bit less, more scrupulous, let's say, a little less discerning in terms of the fishing practices, the manufacturing of the seafood products, and the selling of those products to countries such as the United States. As a US resident, we have to remember that the US represents 5% of the world's population and consumes over 20% of the world's resources. And that includes, of course, resources from the sea. And so not only is it, of course, government's job to rule and regulate a lot of this, but also us as consumers. We are as responsible as the government to help enforce what's going on, not only for enforcement's sake and control of prices and all that, but also the quality of the nutrition, including, of course, things that you would never, ever want to eat if you knew what was in them. So by helping enforce or follow the rules in the United States, we're leading by example, and we're hopefully encouraging other countries to do the same.
I think that's spot on. I mean, it's that balance, right, between sort of a balance of incentives and other forms of encouragement to sort of get people to do the right thing both at home and then to encourage them to do the right thing abroad. Can we talk about one other thing that my understanding is also sort of artificially reduces the price of sea life, and that's subsidies. And if we could talk about subsidies and other incentives hand in hand, can you tell me how subsidies might be increasing fishing pressure artificially, and how there are some incentives that might reduce fishing pressure? So rather than thinking about enforcement and regulations here, can we think about the sort of economic side of subsidies and incentives?
Do you want me to kick this one off?
Sure. Thanks, Kelly.
Okay. And in the same way that that what I just described, as we move further out to sea, it costs more to do operations on the high seas, and what we've seen as a result of that is state-sponsored fishing fleets, and those are, so these are fleets that are subsidized by the government, so that the fishers have access to larger, more robust vessels. They might get fuel as part of that, and again, this has the labor component kind of on the darker side of that. And the United States does not support the state-sponsored subsidies for these fleets, because it puts our fishing fleet at a huge disadvantage because of that cost differential. And it has enabled fishing fleets to get enormous. So there's several countries. I'm not going to get them all off the top of my head, and I apologize. I can pull the list if we need to. But China, Taiwan, the EU, and two others. There's 5 major ones who do this, and the size of those fleets are so big, and they are able to fish so much, and so that has an impact on the total stock status. And if you're doing that within a highly regulatory environment, like in the high seas, that's handled under what's called a regional fisheries management organization. Those catch limits are established, and once they're exceeded, that the countries try to adhere to those. But that also potentially incentivizes the illegal side of going in and continuing to fish beyond what the total allowable catch is for a season. And so it puts pressure on the resource. It has a pervasive incentive on the cost structure of seafood, and I heard, Peter, you adopted the sea life terminology that Fabien prefers, and again, it just disadvantages fishermen like those in the United States who do not have the advantage of subsidies, do not have the advantage of loose regulations, so they're operating at a far higher cost than what fishers who can take advantage of subsidies are.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Kelly, and thank you, Peter, for saying sea life instead of seafood, because it actually gives value to the things we're talking about, right? I'm not against subsidies as a concept, but on execution, per Kelly's point, unfortunately, there are many perversions that are happening because subsidies are allowed or offered. And it doesn't reflect the true value of that entity, whether it's lobster or cod or tuna or what have you. And so when you see the end product, the end results in the supermarket, it doesn't reflect the real cost, not only economically, although that's certainly nuts and bolts for most of us in the supermarket, the restaurant, but also the true value of what that sea life brings to the entire ecosystem. And so by taking or extracting those resources out, those animals or crustaceans or what have you out of that ecosystem, we have to factor in the cost, the real cost of what that means. And by injecting subsidies into the economic system, we're perverting the system in such a way that it does promote abuse. And it does promote a lot of issues that are basically cheating the system and cheating our future. Like I said, I'm all for the concept of supporting folks who are trying to make a living, but we're using the same model as with fossil fuels, and we're seeing where that goes. Now, does the market correct itself when we come to a critical point, or does the government help correct it? Or do individuals make a decision? I think it's a combination of all three of those factors.
Thanks, Fabien. You actually touched on something that we didn't discuss much ahead of time, and that's this idea, this sort of environmental economics idea of externalities, right? Is that the costs to the ecosystem that simply aren't accounted for when you see the price of a fish on the table, or price of a lobster on the tables. It's something that's, it would be interesting to see get factored in more in the economics over time.
And the cost to our health. And not to go off the rails too much, but a lot of times the sea life that you're eating, that's on your plate or that you choose to take, is oftentimes affected by other factors that we're probably not going to have time to talk about today, including pollution. Each one of us has a credit card size worth of plastic in our bodies because we've ingested it through our different consumption of different resources. And so that's something to keep in mind also.
Actually, I think we are going to get right to that. That was the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is, so we've very much focused on, or we've tried to focus on fishing, but there's multiple other ways in which the globe is changing right now. And so how do other aspects of global change, like warming or pollution or habitat destruction, play in and perhaps compound or relieve these fishing pressures?
It's a great question. I mean, I could point to an example that came up on my desk this morning through email. We're discussing certain aspects of coral, for example, coral species and climate change related issues with that, with a person at the IUCN. And in parallel to this, one of my scientific advisors is working on the US National Climate Assessment. And that plays a lot, of course, into that coral reef ecosystem. And the irony of it is these two entities are doing similar research in silos and have not been talking to each other to leverage each other's information and strengths to be efficient. And so there's this is just a typification of the kinds of complexities that are happening in ocean science and conservation, that a lot of times there's no larger communal effort that can be much more efficient, especially with limited resources that we have in ocean research and exploration. So there's one example is climate change related issues, of course, and I see Kelly nodding her head, so I'm sure she's rife with paperwork on her desk on things like this.
Well, these are actually some of my favorite issues to work on. These are not my favorite issues that they are happening. The changes that we're seeing on Earth are unprecedented, and I think I mentioned at the beginning how much I appreciated having an earth science background because of that global perspective and being able to recognize that everything is interconnected. And you mentioned warming, pollution, habitat destruction. If we pull on the thread of any one of those, the whole sweater unravels. And I think we are now at a point in which I studied climate change. I studied climate change in Antarctica, and we understood that this was happening. For me, 20 years later, after I got my PhD, to be able to recognize that it's happening daily in my life, I think is not something I fully expected or understood when I was actively studying climate. The impacts that we're seeing on the ocean are some of them we understand, many of them we don't. From the fishing perspective, stocks are shifting as they try to find their ideal living conditions. And that's great if you can move your environment to move with your favorite temperature. For some of the ocean life, they don't have necessarily the same ability because their entire ecosystem is changing and it may or may not be moving. What does this mean for countries, particularly small island developing states whose livelihoods and economies are based on fishing? What happens when your livelihood moves out of your range? What happens when your country's landmass starts to decrease because of sea level rise? What does that mean for people? You know, this is where I think we need to be taking a very proactive approach as to how do we look further than 1 year into the future as to what kind of fish can we sustainably catch next year. I would like to have a discussion about how many fish can we sustainably catch 50 years in the future, 100 years in the future, and in perpetuity. And to do that, we need to understand what the climate change effects are. We need to stop polluting the ocean, and we need to prevent habitat destruction. And I will put in a plug for the value of marine protected areas as part of the toolkit. And the United States, under President Biden's leadership, has endorsed the need to protect 30% of our planet by the year 2030. And so aggressively going after the types of things that are needed to ensure that not only humans can survive and thrive on this planet, but all life on this planet can continue to survive and thrive.
Well, and those marine protected areas have to be truly protected, right? It can't just be paper parks because we see that all over the place. And Kelly's right. I mean, the ambitious goal of protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030 is a very important one, not just symbolically, but very realistically, as sanctuaries such as marine protected areas will provide that spillover effect that will replenish the natural resource bank account. US has definitely been very proactive in that endeavor, but we're right now, depending on your calculations, anywhere from 8.5% to as low as 2.7% of truly protected areas, again, depending on the calculations you make. And so we have a lot of work left ahead of us. But marine protected areas, as Kelly said, are vital to the approach to be able not only to protect the environment, because I'm not a conservationist per se. I talk conservation, but at the end of the day, it's about protecting our species, but conserving our species. We have to remember that borders don't mean anything to nature. Timelines don't mean anything to nature. They work on their own timelines and everything else. We need to be adapting to that scenario, not the other way around, not trying to have nature adapt to ours. And that's really for the survival and benefit of our own species. And by default, we have to be conservationist minded in our approaches. This is a closed loop system. It's an oasis in space. 3.4 billion cubic kilometers of oceanic volume, within which 95% of our world's biodiversity lives and thrives. So it's extraordinarily important to take ocean into our rhetoric and our consideration in our everyday decision-making processes.
And if I could just put a plug in for a marine protected area right off the coast of Massachusetts. It's a fully protected area. It's the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument. It's the only marine national monument in the entire US Atlantic. And that does represent a fully protected area of the most amazing deep sea corals and life in our own backyard. And so if you guys didn't know about it, take a look and see what spectacular marine life we have protected here in New England.
I will second that for sure. I had the honor and privilege of going there diving myself. So absolutely worth going to take a look, and a perfect example of how to do things right.
I think that's a nice high note to finish on. And what I'd like to do now, we'll come back to have your concluding comments from both of you. But what I'd like to do now is see if there's any questions from the audience and see if we can answer some of those. So
actually, there's Peter. There's one in our chat. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah,
the extreme population duress. Kelly, offline had mentioned cod as an example of something that went a little too far for a little too long. So that's just an interesting example that might be addressing that question.
Okay. And actually, in the Q&A, there's 3 questions from Mary Slocum as a guest. Perhaps I can sort of paraphrase, but the first is, what makes a fishery sustainable? and how has it managed to make it stay sustainable? And then, so maybe Kelly, you could answer that first off.
Yes, it's complicated math in the specific definition of what makes a sustainable fishery under Magnuson-Stevens Act. So I think this one has a mathematical, scientifically based definition as opposed to how we sometimes refer to sustainability writ large. And so again, just to kind of keep it at a very high level, it's to ensure that we are not taking more fish than the population can sustain and repopulate itself year to year. That's pretty simple. Did I get the whole thing there?
I think that's the sort of high level, sort of something that would apply to most of the fisheries. And then her next question is actually directed to Fabien, and she asks, at the grocery store, which species should we be asking about, and how do we get educated about which species we can look at and which species we can?
Yeah, that's a tough one because it's oftentimes regional and where the sources of the fishing happen and so on and so forth. And of course, health-wise. There are seafood guides that are available online as apps or what have you that can help guide better decision-making in restaurants and supermarkets. Typically, a rule of thumb would be to eat further down on the food web. So fish that grow fast, fish and other sea life that grow fast, that are localized, that preferably, locally fished sources. If you can diversify as well. Life is not that complicated. If you look at what makes a species thrive on this planet for long periods of time, it's three basic rules of nature, which is adaptation, diversification, and evolving in our mental approaches. What is it that you want to eat versus not want to eat? One of the key aspects of conservation, I feel anyway, at least for me, that works for me, is not necessarily saying no to everything, but making sure that when you do choose something that's less sustainable than something else, that you don't do so on a regular basis, that it's a treat, that it's something that's a rarity. But by and large, if you can avoid all the larger fish, the pelagics, the slow-growing animals, lions and tigers of the sea, if you will, then that's already a good start. Additionally, avoid things that bioaccumulate all sorts of toxins and man-made pollution.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
I really appreciate the willingness of individuals to really take on some of the burden of making the planet a better place. But I'll do a call for action for collective action so that we can make a global impact. And I think that's what is incumbent upon representatives of governments to try and make sure that that we are doing things in the most beneficial way to support the health of the planet, and to ensure that you as an individual don't have to be making decisions on behalf of the planet. I recognize that's what all of us are trying to do is make good decisions and support that. But I also just wanted to make the commitment that what we're trying to do on your behalf as citizens of this country is to help make all of those things better across the board through collective actions.
Yeah, I mean, we're all in the proverbial same boat, right? So if we can support each other, we'll be much further ahead in this cause.
It's really interesting because, here at BU over the last couple of years, I've noticed how the university has made really rapid strides on diversity issues, where this is a different issue, but there's a lot to be done. But it's definitely helped by there being a top-down approach from the top, from the president and provost office, and a bottom-up approach from the faculty and students. So when those two things go together hand in hand, I think we can make rapid progress on almost any issue.
Yeah, the role of the private sector can't be understated here. So
we have another question, which I think you just touched on a little bit, and this is from Jeff K. How does the consumer know that the fish species being sold is actually what the seller says it is? And what's the role of technology what role is technology playing to study fish stock and track, reduce illegal fishing?
That is an excellent, excellent question. So I know in the US, it's not popular to order seafood or sea life with a head on it. But that definitely is an easy indicator. In Europe, we usually present a dish with a full fish in it, and you can see the head. So therefore, it's easier to identify what species it is. But you're absolutely right. If you're ordering fillets or frozen foods or what have you, it's much more difficult to verify what kind of animal it is. And so how do you know that you're getting what you paid for? And so there are kits nowadays, believe it or not. They're not very popular, but there are kits nowadays that you can check what kind of animal it is, what kind of species it is, in within a few minutes. I believe it's 15 minutes as soon as it's served to you. Or if you're in the supermarket, it's a little DNA test kit that you can buy online. They're hard to find and not popular, but there are ways to, technologically speaking, there are ways to tell nowadays.
I'd add to that, Jeff, there's a number of university courses across the country that call themselves sort of forensic fisheries courses, and they're taking DNA samples from fish they find in supermarkets or in the fish market where the landings occur, and identifying using DNA, tracing the fish back to the stock, or identifying the species, but even back to stock as well. So
there's no substitute for education. Knowledge is power.
Kelly, did you want to add something?
Yeah, no substitute for science. To shed light on these things, as Fabien indicated, it's very hard to tell what we've been served on a plate, if it's actually what it is. And you know, one of the ways to do that is to buy your fish directly from a fisher. They tend to know, and the complexity of the global seafood market, what's caught in the United States might get shipped overseas for processing and re-imported into the United States, and you lose visibility into that. And once it's processed, to Fabien's point, it's really hard to see what it is without that scientific analysis to determine if the fish you're eating is in fact what it says it is. And so technology has also been really helpful at shining a light onto places on Earth that we don't normally have visibility into, like the high seas. The satellite imagery, we're able to see who's fishing where in a way that we never were, which enables us to identify potential bad actors who might be conducting IUU fishing activities, identify them, and use the tools available to us to hold them accountable. We still have work to do. It's still very difficult, but the number of groups out there who are committed to this and committed to working with governments to help us see that information is super useful. And then I'd also just make a point about the importance of data, of sharing data. Making data transparent where we are able to help the global common kind of contribute to looking at these issues. So all the layers of science, technology, and data working together on behalf of better outcomes for the ocean.
I just want to finish with one final question. This is from Ron Landis, also a guest, and it's a question about the role of the media. And the exact question is, what media or propaganda is distributed to people in the US as well as international countries addressing overfishing? So I guess, BU has a massive communications department, like very highly ranked in the country. And so I'm curious to sort of link those things together and say, what is the role of the media in this, and how can they help or hinder progress?
Well, media is a bullhorn, right? Media is a conduit. It's nothing more than that, and it can be directed one way or another. So it's neither good nor bad. It depends on the usage. It's extraordinarily important, especially for the ocean. I mean, look what's happened to shark populations because of their ill-fated reputation to early media. And now ever since then, it's been a lot of backpedaling, and thanks to some media, there's been some progress in that. Many of us will never get a chance to get a high school education, much less a university education. So media is a source of information that can be extraordinarily powerful one way or another, either to decimate or to protect. And in the case of what we're talking about, it's extremely important to, as a consumer, to choose the right, a platform, a media platform that you are confident comes from facts, from science, from bona fide sources, and not just a lot of the background noise and opinions and junk that's out there. It can pervert conversations very easily, as we've seen in all sorts of circles, whether they be political, social, or other. And it can breed vitriol, it can breed passion, it can breed all sorts of things. And so media is probably the most powerful tool we have in our toolbox today. And for ocean conservation, and I'll do a personal plea and plug here, which is look at the Goliath grouper in Florida. It's something that's not talked about because it's the issue is being hidden, and the science is, unfortunately, the bona fide science is being hidden, and the facts are being perverted in order to benefit a very small group of people to go and fish the last healthy population of Goliath grouper, which are in the Florida Keys and in Florida. And the reason why I can say that's the last healthy population is because they've been afforded protection since the early 1980s. And now their protection is not only being stripped, but selective culling, as you call it, is being chosen. Now, the problem with that, with regard to Goliath groupers, they're very slow growing animals. They're puppy dogs. They're completely inoffensive. They're stationary for the most part. And any selective culling will wipe out that population, as far as what we've seen in history and in facts and in science. So to go back to the point, is media would play an important role in influencing the degradation or the protection of that particular species. And more generally around the world, it is a vital tool, if used properly, for all of this. And to amplify the good news out there, not just the bad news, but the good news out there, all the good work that Kelly and the US government are doing with regard to their work, individuals and small communities around the world. Because at the end of the day, breeding hope is one of those motivating factors that makes people not only feel good, but realize that it's not all doom and gloom, and we can make a difference if we put our minds to it. But media plays a vital role in this.
Thanks, Fabien. We are up on the hour, so this has been a wonderful conversation, and thanks to the audience for their questions. I'm going to give you both one last sentence. You have one sentence to finish off. Is there anything final you would like to leave the audience with before we all log off? Kelly.
We've talked about some tough issues today, and I just want to leave the audience with a sense of hope. I'm a complete optimist, and I think that we can, through working together to address these big, messy problems, that we can make progress, and that there's hope for all of us in the future, and especially our ocean.
Thanks, Fabien.
One sentence. Okay. Well, since we are ocean. No ocean, no life, no healthy ocean, no healthy future. It's very simple. So I'll leave you with one sentence that, especially since we're on an education platform today, that my grandfather gave me as probably my most valuable inheritance. And it's summarized in this one sentence. People protect what they love what they understand, and they understand what they're taught.
That's a fantastic way to finish. Thank you both so much for your time. I know you're both very busy people. Thanks to the attendees, and with that, enjoy the rest of your weeks, people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, and thanks to the participants for tuning in.